Okay, so I've got a question about the difference between wisdom and intelligence. And there's one way to look at this is, I'm going to put it down as like wisdom versus IQ, because personally I think that intelligence sort of comes over on this side. So I'm putting IQ in quotes. When I was in Mensa, I was struck by two things. The vast majority of people that I met in Mensa were very ordinary. They did not strike me as particularly intelligent. And you guys actually, by your questions, by your attitudes, and by your comments, strike me as more intelligent than the people I met in Mensa. And I'm not saying I think you guys have high IQs. I have no idea what your IQs would be. Probably on the high side, but maybe not high enough to get into Mensa. I don't think that's relevant, because I think intelligence has a lot to do with how you use the thinking machinery you've got, as well as the thinking machinery you've got. IQ, as far as I can tell, is not a good measure of even of thinking machinery. It's just one type of thinking machinery. So I'm going to, over here, is put in the term thinking gear. So we all have structures in our brains that allow us to think about various things and to create stuff and stuff like that. And we're all different, and some of us have sort of genius machinery: Einstein, Darwin, Mozart, Beethoven, Richard Feynman. A lot of people have the kind of machinery that allows them to think up amazing things. So they just I can't do calculus. Calculus I have enormous trouble with. I would only do it very, very slowly. I certainly could not sit down and do it right now. I may not ever even be able to do it with the textbook open right beside me. I have enormous trouble with calculus. So I would say that's something that's beyond me. And there's certain logical things that I know I've butted up against the limits of my intelligence and my thinking machinery in a number of directions. And there's lots and lots of technical areas that I just don't understand. Right? And we all have the different, and we're good at some things and bad at other things, because we have this thinking machinery in our heads. And I think that the people I met in Mensa were ordinary because not because of the particular thinking gear they had in their heads, but because of how they used it. And that's where I think that the difference between wisdom and IQ, or wisdom and your thinking machinery, or wisdom and intellectual capacity, is how it's used. So there were people in Mensa, the vast majority were perfectly nice people who were just sort of ordinary, and I did not particularly enjoy talking to them. I mean, I'll have a random conversation with someone I meet at a coffee shop, and generally I'll enjoy the conversation because usually they have something, people usually have something interesting to say, particularly students. When I have conversations with students, they tell me amazing things, very interesting things, and demonstrate thoughtfulness. Right? But with the Mensans, they just talked about sports, or the conventional wisdom of politics, of the usual pompous stuff you get from television. I mean, it was just not any. I mean, obviously it's a very small sample, but the people I ran into in Mensa had very little in terms of insight or knowledge of the world. The stuff, it was kind of it was boring. But there was a small fraction of people in Mensa who were Olympic quality idiots. If you had an Olympics of idiocy, these people would be your candidates, your contenders, your gold medalists. Because these people would say the stupidest things, things that were amazingly stupid, things that had no connection to reality, things that were just flew in the face of all the available evidence. They were just barking mad. And I worked out that what seemed to me to be going on was that they had these things that they wanted to believe, and they took their magnificent thinking machinery, their IQ, their ability to think stuff up, and to put it to the service of making these dumb ideas seem smart, at least to themselves. And so, to me, that's the difference between what is worthy of being called wisdom and mere intelligence. But it's also how I define intelligent. An intelligent person is not someone who has a high IQ or has a high native ability. An intelligent person is someone who uses their ability, who in the appropriate way, who actually thinks about stuff. And one of the bullet points I think about wisdom, to distinguish it from ordinary kinds of thinking, is humility. Right? The wise person is not really out there, oh, I'm so much smarter than you. Because I've met lots of people who thought they were smarter than me, and they were usually pretty stupid. And all the people I've met who were actually smarter than me didn't care about who was smarter than who. It just was not on their radar as a concept. It was a ludicrous concept to them. Fallibilist. A fallibilist is someone who takes as part of his view of the world that he can be wrong. Right? I'm a fallibilist because I think, you know what, I could be wrong about just about anything. And so a wise person, someone gets to be wise by being careful in how they think. That they think things through carefully, and they're what I would also call tentative. Right? They're not quick to make up their minds. Right? I find arrogant people often jump to conclusions, and I've had students and I've had people who thought they were geniuses because they had not thought things through, and they never thought things through, so they never realized they were wrong. So they say, hey, I've never figured out that I'm wrong about anything. That must mean I'm right about everything. And it's not, it means the opposite. Right? It's that, so someone who's really using their brains will know that life is complicated, will know the universe is complicated, and that most of the things that most of our important conclusions are not as well supported as we'd like them to be. Things are not cut and dried. And so a wise person is likely to say things that, well, you know, I'm not so sure about this. I think this might be true. It might be this, it might be that. And that, you know, if they're if they're thinking logically and they're thinking carefully and they spend a lot of time thinking, they're very likely to be right. But the person who speaks definitely is quite often the person who hasn't thought things through. So that's a big thing. When you guys strike me as careful thinkers. You don't come to conclusions right away. You take the time and you're aware, I could be wrong about this. So there's that tentativity. There's also tolerance. Now, tolerance is kind of a complicated thing, there's this meme floating around on the internet from conservatives say, well, you liberals are also value tolerance, but when I stand up for Christian values, you attack me. You know, when I disagree with you, you attack me, and you're hypocrites because you. It's like, dear, no. We're for tolerance, so that when you are intolerant, we're against that, right? Liberals are against intolerance, so we don't tolerate intolerance. That's what being against something means. And usually it comes around when someone has said something horribly racist, or horribly sexist, or horribly homophobic, and they've been criticized for it. Oh, you're supposed to be tolerant. Right? Well, we don't tolerate Hitler, and we don't tolerate bigots. There was a period a few months ago when all these bigots were complaining about being called bigots. And it's like, yeah, sure. So, but on the other hand, someone who's truly wise doesn't go spend a lot of time calling people bigots. Someone who's truly wise, it's like, okay, you know, you understand this kind of stuff. You tolerate, particularly you tolerate principled disagreement. Right? I mean, I come down on Rand Paul because he plagiarizes and he demonstrates patronizing ignorance towards other people. It's just offensive. He also visited a Hispanic conference, and he lectured Hispanic people about what they believe, and what he thought they would believe is different from what they actually believe, as demonstrated by repeated polling data. He says, you have the same values as Republicans. You believe in this stuff and this stuff and this stuff. And it's like, well, the polls say different. And Chris Christie lying through his teeth. So you've got to speak out against wrongdoing when you see it. But on the other hand, you know, Paul Ryan, I really disagree with his beliefs, his claims, his ideas. Haven't seen him telling any lies that I know of. I haven't seen him plagiarizing from Wikipedia. And he's not such an obstructionist as the rest of the Republicans in the Senate. So, got some good words for Paul Ryan. He and I disagree, but you know, you pay attention to character rather than specific beliefs. A wise person doesn't continuously attack people who disagree with them. A wise person listens. Another thing about a wise person is that they're not Morgan Freeman. And I say this picking up Morgan Freeman specifically because people like to quote him, and they like to put up memes with him. And I remember a few months ago, there was a meme, an image of Morgan Freeman with a statement, and then his name. And it was probably the dumbest thing I'd ever seen. And some of my friends were posting it like, wise words. Why are they wise words? Because it's Morgan Freeman, and he looks looks wise, and he played Nelson Mandela, and he's played God and Driving Miss Daisy, and he's got this sort of, he's had these characters that are portrayed. Say again?
I think it feeds into some of the stereotyped perception of some people.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, they wanted to. And what happened was, somebody in an interview asked him about his views on racism. And there was some kind of question, it's like, well, what would you do about racism? Why? And he said, stop talking about it. That's Morgan Freeman's cure for racism. Stop talking about race. And that is the dumbest thing I'd ever heard. Because if liberals stop talking about racism, racists will go on being racists. I mean, racists don't really talk about racism. They say bad things about black people, bad things about Mexican, things about non-white people or people who are not their own race. They say they discriminate in hiring, discriminate in lending, discriminating in housing. The reason we have poor black neighborhoods, black ghettos, is because there's been discrimination in lending since the end of World War II, since before most of those neighborhoods were built. There's a lack of capital in those neighborhoods, and that's been promoted by the real estate industry and by the lending industry since World War II. It used to be official government policy to discriminate against black people or even people who lived near black people. You couldn't get a loan. So we have all this stuff, and there's this stuff that if you want to understand racism, you have to talk about it. You have to look at the history. You have to look at what government policies have done, what real estate companies have done, what banks have done, what lending companies have done, what the police do, how the police fail. You have to talk about it. So Morgan Freeman saying we can solve racism by pretending it doesn't exist, by not talking about it, is just the most insanely stupid thing I've ever heard. And people I thought were fairly intelligent posted this meme to stop talking about it, as if Morgan Freeman had any idea what he was talking about, and as if it wasn't the dumb. I mean, I don't remember hearing anything dumber, not even on the internet. So the thing is, it's the Morgan Freeman saying it in the Morgan Freeman voice, and it sounds like it's really wise, but it's not. It's mind-numbingly stupid. Question?
Yes, I was actually going to comment about racism.
Okay.
My husband is from Washington, D.C., and as a matter of fact, he's older than I am, a few years older. And he lived through a lot of the congregations and so, have black people only stay in one neighborhood, have whites stay over here. In Baltimore, you go in there and you see the poverty. And if a white person will move next to them, then the houses will start going higher.
Yeah.
But as long as there's no whites or anything on the scene, their houses are very low, and they cannot get any assistance from the government and so.
Yeah.
Because they're called the crack houses and stuff like that, which they're not.
Yes,
So.
right. It's racism. Racism is actually all goes on under the radar now, which is better than when it was above the radar, better than when it was government policy, but it's still there.
Yes.
And you have to expose it in order to stop it. Right. And you have to expose it where it's actually at. Some of my liberal friends used to post memes claiming that make comments claiming that the Tea Party is racist. I never saw any evidence that the Tea Party was racist. Nobody came up with evidence. There was one guy who had the sign saying taxpayers are the new N-word and government is massa. But he wasn't saying that black people should be slaves, or he wasn't saying anything negative of black people. He was assaulting the government. He's basically saying that taxation is like slavery, which is an idiotic thing to say, but it wasn't racist. Okay, the real racist, you want to look at the real racist, see how loans are being written in various neighborhoods. You look at, as you say, look at house prices.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, the whole thing about the difference between wisdom and mere intelligence, I think someone who's got the thinking machinery that we normally call intelligence, but doesn't use it very well, is not a wise person, not even really intelligent. I'd much rather deal with someone who uses what they've got in an attempt to genuinely find out the truth. And so and it goes back to the difference between defensive and critical thinking.
Thank you.
So I got all these exercises in the examples and exercises in the reading that I hope you read, that about breaking down arguments into standard form, breaking down arguments into the breakdown box. And now I want to talk about tactics. Okay. You know what the word tactile means?
Touch.
Touch, right? Now, you guys know the difference between strategy and tactics in warfare? Strategy is everything you do outside of contact with the enemy. Tactics is what you do in contact with the enemy. So, if that's the enemy, strategy is everything I do out here, moving around, disposing my forces. When I come in contact with the enemy, that's tactics. And strategy and tactics are two different parts of military science. So, in logic, strategy, in logic, as I use the term, and this terminology is, as far as I know, is new. I came up with this terminology. I don't know if anyone else uses it. But when I talk about strategy, an argument strategy is something that can be done when there's nobody else arguing, right? So you think you're gonna engage with somebody else about something and try and make a case for something, and you have no idea what they're going to say, and as far as you know, they're just going to accept your argument. The kind of arguments you come up with, that would be strategy, because you're thinking up what argument can I make independently of what anybody else is going to say. So when we talk about a sampling argument refers to the evidence and draws a conclusion from the evidence. Doesn't talk about other arguments. So arguments that draw conclusions about the world from evidence without mentioning other arguments. So if I'm not talking about another argument, I'm doing strategy. Now, on the other hand, there's tactics. Right. Tactics is you're engaged in a debate. You're in contact with the opposition. Maybe not an enemy, but someone who disagrees with you. Right? So that's why it's tactics is, the tactics is, and then it goes differently, because tactics is the study of how arguments relate to each other. So arguments considered in relation to other arguments. Now, if you're, you're writing a paper and you have no idea about your audience and you write a set of arguments, that's strategy, because you're not thinking about what other people are going to say. But if you're getting prepared for a debate, whether or you're writing an article and you think that people are going to be replying to you, which is the normal thing, you think it's going to be controversial, and you think that other people are going to comment on your paper, or you're getting ready for a face-to-face debate, you're going to have some kind of exchange, or there's going to be like a Facebook thing or conversation. When you do that, you think about what the other person's going to say, what their arguments are, how they might reply to your arguments, and so you consider other arguments, and that's the area of tactics, and it's sort of a little more advanced than strategy. And so when I talk about tactics, I'm talking about arguments considered in relation to other arguments. And so now I want to make what I think is another important distinction. So, all right. So you can make a decision. You can look at arguments and say, well, is this strategic or tactical? You can say, are they making an argument that can stand alone, or are they trying to head off other people's arguments? Right. Now, when you're talking about tactics, there's two kinds of arguments. When you look at logic in terms of tactics, there's two kinds of arguments. So I got this term, direct arguments. A direct argument is an argument that stands on its own. Oops. Maybe that's better. An argument that stands on its own without reference to any other argument, without implying or saying anything about another argument. So when you look at when you look at the arguments we looked at last week, a sampling argument is a direct argument.
Just doing fire extinguishers, excuse us for 1 second.
Okay. So a sampling argument is one kind of direct argument because it's not referring to any other arguments. When you make an argument based on a sample, you say, here's the sample, here's the population, the sample has this feature, so we think the population has the feature. And then, the details about how the sample was taken and so on. It's not referring to any other kind of argument. And when I talk about strategies, I'm usually talking about strategies for direct arguments. There's a number of strategies that I'm going to talk about over the next few weeks. I'm going to talk about correlation arguments, which are based on correlations and are usually used to establish causal claims. Authority arguments, which are based on things people say. Burden of proof arguments are more complicated. You make it support a negative claim by citing a lack of evidence. There's a number of ways of trying to establish that a claim is true. So, I'm going to put that in there. Direct arguments try to establish claims. A direct argument tries to establish that some claim about the world is true. The other kind of argument, when we're doing tactical analysis, is counter-arguments. Now, I use the word counter-argument in a specific technical sense because I want to make a distinction between two different kinds of things that people can say back to you. If you're in a debate and you give an argument, your opponent can come back with a direct argument or a counter-argument. That is, they could oppose you, they would make an opposing argument, but that opposing argument might be a direct argument or it might be a counter-argument. So I want to reserve the term counter-argument for one particular kind of argument they can make. And this is the way it goes. Counter-arguments attempt to show flaws in the logic of specific other arguments. So have you ever had someone tell you that your argument must be wrong because they have an argument against your claim but has nothing to do with your argument? Did they change the subject? Remember the example I was talking about, the Rachel Maddow show, and this politician saying that there's some culpability of the Obama administration in regards to the Benghazi incident? Right? And then the Maddow and her friends are laughing at the guy, and one guy says, yeah, there was this article that said that that was all rubbish. But they didn't look at what the senator's argument was. So one way a debate can go is you have the pro side and the con side. The pro side makes an argument, and the con side ignores the argument that was just made, changes the subject, and makes an argument for its side that has nothing to do with the other side's argument. So they can't say that there's anything wrong with the other argument. And that means that they've got two direct arguments and no counter-arguments. The Maddow people made no counter-argument to the senator, to the congressman. I don't know if he's right or wrong, but they didn't make an argument. They didn't knock down his argument. They changed the subject and gave their own argument for a contrary position, which is a different thing. And I'm going to, if you don't understand this now, I'm going to hammer on this again and again as we go along. This is going to be a repeated thing as we go along. So, right. So right now, all I want you to think about this. So I'll put it up this. If you've made an argument and someone makes an argument, oops, someone makes an argument against you, that new arg, if it's just one argument they're making, if they just make one, what I call an atomic argument, which is the most basically broken down argument, that's the smallest piece of argument, smallest piece of logic that could be called an argument, if that person makes an argument against you, that new argument could be either a direct argument or a counter argument. There are two kinds of argument that someone could make against you. And if someone else has made an argument and you're arguing against them, there are two kinds of argument that you could make. And realistically, to prove if they're wrong and you're right, and you want to prove that they're wrong and that you're right, you have to do two things. You have to knock down their argument, and you have to make your own argument for your claim. You can't do it with just one argument. Once they have an argument in play, that argument has to be knocked down. Otherwise, you don't win.
And you would knock them down with the counter argument, right?
With a counter argument,
Because
exactly.
you're showing the flaws in their argument, but then you want to make a direct argument as well so that you're getting your point across.
Exactly. That is absolutely right. I'm gonna put that up too. Right, and I'm putting if you're right and they're wrong, you have to do two things. You have to, one, knock down their arguments, with counter arguments, and two, prove your point with an unassailable direct argument. So here's that deal there, is if you're right and they're wrong, you may not be right, and if you're not right, hopefully you'll realize it in the argumenting process. But assuming you're right, being right and proving that you're right are two different things. So if you actually were right, you would be able to knock down their arguments with counter arguments, and you would have an unassailable direct argument. So to take one step back,
Unassailable mean that you can't, like they have nothing against your argument?
yeah, unassailable, that's right. Unassailable means that they have nothing against your argument. They don't have a counter argument, a good counter argument against yours. And really, to settle an issue, there's a lot of back and forth. The gay marriage issue is a comparatively simple issue. It was made complicated for me by the fact that my idiot friend Darrell assured me that there were serious problems of religious freedom with making gay marriage legal. He was lying. I mean, he was repeating stuff that he'd gotten from the Mormon church that he passed on without thinking, which is what Darrell does. But I was like, oh, that sounds serious. Okay. And then I did a little reading, heard a little news, did a little thinking, and like, my God, he's just so full of crap. But it takes a while. So to tell if you're right, ask two questions. one, can I counter all the opposing direct arguments? Right. There are a number of, there's about a dozen, I think, commonly repeated arguments against gay marriage that show up frequently. There may be a few more that are even more obscure and ridiculous. So let's say there's about a dozen arguments available against gay marriage that are not immediately ridiculous. Right. And then there's the second question. Is there at least one direct argument on my side that has never been successfully counted? So, so if you've got an opinion, if you've formed an opinion, you can review it by saying, look, can I really counter all of the opposing direct arguments? If you've come to an opinion, you know, if you're being hyper-rational, you come to an opinion, you would come to an opinion after looking at all the arguments over the on both sides, which is what I think I did for gay marriage. So Daryl had all these arguments against gay marriage, and I looked into each one of them, and every one of them was based on misstating facts. And then I went on the internet and I looked at all kinds of other arguments against gay marriage, and they were all wrong. They all turned out to be wrong. Some of them were absolutely ludicrous. There was one fellow who said that if you allow gay marriage, men will realize that they can have sex with other men, and they will like that better than sex with women, so women will never get any sex and the human race will die out. And I just read that 3 times before I could accept that that's what he was actually saying. And it made a lot of claims about the Roman Empire, and it showed that the guy actually knew nothing about the Roman Empire, because the Romans were actually homophobic. That may be where European cultures get homophobia from, because the Romans were radically homophobic. They hated homosexuality. They would execute people for being gay, or punish them or ostracize them in various ways. So the Romans would not have gay marriage. I mean, there were homosexuals in all walks of Roman life. I mean, it existed just as it exists everywhere. But the Romans would be really horrible about it. They were bastards. But in human society, whether you could be a successful homosexual or not usually depended on what your social class was. If you were a member of the aristocracy and could keep it quiet, you could do anything you like. So.
I don't understand how people are comfortable giving information that's untrue that they already know that's not true. Like your friend, how he just like spews out information and then you like tell him like, no, that's not true. Like for me personally, if someone's like, oh, like what you're saying is not true, I wouldn't be comfortable like feeding it out to people, like feeding out the wrong information. I would just be like, oh, okay, like that's wrong, then I won't tell anyone else about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like you. I've given out false information because I made mistakes, or I listened to the wrong people, or I just, and when someone confronts me with it, I'm often like, oh my God, and sometimes they just have to say, are you sure that's true? And I think about it and go, oh my God, no, I have no basis for this. This is, or even this is dumb. I remember, I don't remember the subject, but I remember once being painfully embarrassed because I started saying something that I believed to be true, and halfway through the explanation I realized I was talking complete nonsense, and I had to, and it was very hard to make myself stop, because once you started saying something you really want to say, I really wanted to say it, even though I knew it was true, and I said, no, I'm talking rubbish, this is wrong, sorry, ignore me. Like, people are like, well, what are you saying? Like, no, I'm saying something stupid. It's like, can we change the subject, please?
Yeah, I get really uncomfortable once
Yeah.
giving, like, I don't know, like, if I have to, like, for instance, if I had to, like, cover for one of my friends or something that they lied about, and I, like, was in the middle where I couldn't really give someone the true information.
Yeah,
like,
you
I
have
just
to
get
cover for
really
your friends, you
uncomfortable.
don't want to lie to do it.
Yeah.
It's really bad, I've done that too, and it's really, really painful, and I hate being in that position, and I don't think a real friend will put you in that
But
position.
some people,
But sometimes,
Dr. Young is from this, just an example he gave, he's smart. Not only smart, but he's wise, and he has the humility to take back whatever. Some people, absolutely, they have one, but they lack two.
yeah.
So you can't, and it's in their view, in their mind, in their brain, that's just what it is.
It is a complicated subject, and you have to look at how people's feelings and how people act to protect their self-interest, self-image, to feel that they're right, to feel that they're the center of attention, to feel like that. I've actually done a lot of reading on self-deception, and it really amazes me that how well people can lie and fool themselves. And I've seen this in people I've been around. I try not to be around people like that, but in my past I made some poor choices and ended up hanging out with imbeciles or liars and things, and watching them convince themselves of things that they really knew were not true was really stunning to me. I've seen people talk themselves into believing things that they actually know are not true, that they've seen, all the evidence says it's not true, but they persist in believing it, and they just keep repeating it. And part of it is when people repeat stuff to themselves, they say it to convince themselves.
It becomes imprinted.
And my friend Daryl, really stunning example of someone who would be perfectly aware of the right information and would just not think about it. Oh my God, man, if I thought about that stuff, I'd go crazy. But if you don't think about that stuff, you go wrong.
Yeah.
Right? The evidence is that people tend to believe what they want to believe, and they manipulate their own consciousness so that they don't have to be confronted with opposition. And one of the things, or the horrifying things about the Tea Party movement, apart from the fact that it's making Republicans unelectable all across the country, is that they say these, they get into Congress and they say these insane things. There was the senior Republican on the House Science Committee said that I heard all these things about science in school and they told me this stuff. And I think he was mainly referring to evolution, but he didn't specifically say that he was talking about science, all this science stuff. And now I know that it's all lies straight from the pit of hell. And this guy's in Congress. So we have people saying things that a moment's reflection would tell you that's not true, but they passionately believe them. And people generally tend to work on passion, which is why logic is a hard road to tell when you teach. You need, it's easy to teach people who want to be logical, because it's all really simple. But in my logic, I sometimes have students who do not want to be logical, and it's very hard to get across to them. And actually, there are certain writing topics that I will not use, because the students who pick those topics write it because they passionately believe something. It'll be. I used to have an introductory philosophy class where I had a topic where you could talk about arguments for the existence of God, and what I was hoping for is people would take them and logically analyze them. That's not what happened. What happened was the students who could do this didn't want to do it. They found it kind of boring. And the students who wanted to do this couldn't do the analysis because they wanted to, I'll write a paper where I prove that God exists. And they basically, over the whole class, says, God exists, I really feel this. God exists because the world couldn't exist without God. And they'd give all these horrible arguments, and they wouldn't do any logical analysis. So I got to say, well, you know, that you failed. And I don't want to fail people. So now I don't have those topics, so that those students who might be trapped by those topics do other topics where they can be more rational and learn something, rather than bashing their head against just doing. So self-deception is a huge thing. We all have kind of a tendency towards it, and being a wise person is about avoiding being fallible, saying, hey, I could be wrong.
Yeah, well, some people have a really hard time like throwing away their feelings to realize like what's actually going on.
Yeah.
I have a lot of people who surround me, so this class, I really enjoy this class because I like everything you say, I picture someone from my life. So it's so funny.
I know,
Yeah,
seriously.
it is.
I'm like, work.
Yeah.
I wish people would realize that I'm the logical one.
Yeah, I know. They
Put away
don't. don't.
the feelings.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really hard.
I am logical.
Yeah.
Does this relate to some people that are highly educated, like really PhDs?
Oh yes.
But they're
You were talking about PhDs
completely
before.
out of touch with reality.
Oh yes. I have a
That
PhD
was-
and
that was
I have been
intelligence
out of
wisdom,
touch
that
with
I would
reality.
say. Yeah.
Seriously. I've been in situations, this is in my personal life, and there's a number of relationships I had where my beliefs about what's going on in the relationship or what the relationship is worth were completely out of touch with what was actually going on. And it was very painful to realize that the person I was with didn't even really like me and was being abusive, and to realize that I'd made a horrible mistake in getting into that relationship. And there are other things where I've had beliefs about things where I've been completely out of touch with reality, and I would look back on that, and I would not want to think about it because I was so amazingly clueless. And I didn't always have the PhD, but I always had pretty much the same thinking machinery. And I have met PhDs and read about PhDs who have no freaking clue, sometimes about their very subject. And there's this guy, Ray Kurzweil, who is a genius at computer science. He's one of the founding geniuses of computer science and computing, and quite a considerable chunk of the modern internet and computer processing was actually invented by Ray Kurzweil. And then he starts talking about philosophy and what he calls transhumanism of humans, of human intelligence transcending the human body, and it's all cobblers. It's all nonsense, because he knows nothing about this stuff and he can't think about it. But he's really excited about it, so he writes these books and he has these followers, and he can't make any sense about it. It's just dumb. So I had to watch when I talk about things that I don't know a lot about, because I could be completely, talk complete nonsense at any time. All right, so what I want to do is, what I want to talk about is the difference between a direct argument and a counter argument. And so and I'm going to do this as a diagram with two breakdown boxes. And so suppose this is the pro side. Suppose this is our side and this is the opposing side. So we have two arguments. For a proposition, I'll call it P, proposition P. So we have the pro side says P is true, the con side says P is false. Sometimes the con side will just say P is unproven. Right? You see, there's this thing in debates sometimes that both sides says, you might have, this side says that this claim is false, this side says that the claim is true, and they could both be wrong. And that's why I like to say, in every dispute, at least one of the sides is wrong. Because it could be that P is not proven, is unproven. It could turn out that P is not supported by the evidence and it's not opposed by the evidence. It's something that could be true or it could be false. But this side insists it's true, this side insists it's false. And we'll just stick with that. Now, when you have opposing direct arguments, the premises imply that P is false, so they oppose the conclusion. But there's no arrow across. They oppose only the conclusion. So they oppose only the opposing conclusion. So you have that these premises imply that this is false. But that's not a counter-argument, because you have to remember that if these premises imply that this is true, then they oppose that conclusion, and so you actually have another arrow, equally powerful. I'm just going to do it in a contrasting color. Right? So you have two opposing direct arguments. My premises say that your conclusion is false, and your premises say that my conclusion is false. Can't settle the issue without showing that some argument is bad. And this happens that a lot of debates, each side gives arguments for its side, and they think they proved the other side wrong because they have arguments that they like that prove them right, which means the other side's wrong, but they're not saying anything about the logic of the other side's argument. You notice there's no arrows across. The premises of this argument ignore the premises of the other argument. So, because these are direct arguments, the pro premises ignore the con premises. Right, they imply that the con conclusion is false, but they don't say anything about the con premises. And the con premises over here ignore the pro premises.
That would make it a bad argument, right?
Say again?
That would make it a bad argument if they can't.
Well, it doesn't necessarily make it a bad argument.
Because aren't you not supposed to ignore the premises of either side if you're trying to prove the other wrong?
Yes, if you're trying to prove the other wrong, you've got to attack these premises.
Yeah.
and that's it. You're looking ahead to the next phase. So if you no, this is good, right? It's not necessarily a bad argument. We don't know if this is a good or bad argument, because here's another argument that equally well could be good. And this is the position you're in. If you see two sides arguing, and their arguments have nothing to do with each other, and this used to happen to me. I'd read one side, and I'd agree with it while I was reading it, and then I'd read the opposing side, and I'd agree with it while I was reading it, and then I wouldn't be able to decide because I agreed with both sides, because both sides looked good to me. And that's before I learned I had to criticize the arguments and subject them to scrutiny. And it's really an uncomfortable position. It was really weird to realize I agree with whoever is speaking. I thought I was smart, but I'm not. You know, I have to learn some stuff and figure out how to deal with this. So if we're in this position, we're not really making progress. We've got something done. We've got the arguments. But if they ignore each other's premises, so what you would have to do in this situation is you would criticize these arguments and figure out which one was strong, which one was weak. So, different color. I guess I'm going to use green. Hopefully green will work.
So you're just proving that those arguments can't be settled to come to a consensus because they're ignoring both evidence, both sides of evidence? Okay.
That's exactly right. We can't settle the issue. If I have something that looks like a good argument here, and on one side, and something that looks like a good argument on the other side, I can't decide. There's no logical way to decide without looking at those arguments and seeing if one of them turns out to be bad. Now, if they both turn out to be bad, I still can't decide. I might say, look, it's not proven either way because the arguments on both sides are rubbish. So we might say, look, I don't know if it's true or false, it's unproven. But if I find out one argument stands up to criticism, that it's like, it doesn't fall down, I can't find anything wrong with it, and I've looked really hard, whereas the other one falls down, like this has got a major problem, so one argument falls down and one argument stays standing, that's the good argument. Then it wins, right? Then that side wins, at least until we think of something else. So now here, I've got opposing direct arguments. Here, this diagram is going to be a direct and a counter argument. And that goes kind of different. And that's, you've got the pro side with premises and conclusion. And then you have the con side, but this time it's going to be a counter argument. And I'm just going to to emphasize the difference, you have a con argument that's a direct argument up there. It's a con argument, it's a direct argument. Here's a con argument that's a counter argument. And, P is true. And you have premises here. And this is premises that engage the opposing premises, that say something about the logic of the other argument by talking about the premises of the argument and how they're related to the conclusion. And here we have the argument goes straight across, the arrow goes straight across. Right? So these premises say something about the logic of this argument, which means they say something about these premises, not talking about the conclusion. A counterargument basically ignores the conclusion that the argument is attacking. It doesn't try to establish that that conclusion is false, because the conclusion of a counterargument, when it's properly understood as a counterargument, is that the conclusion of the counter-argument is basically that the pro-argument is not logically good. It's not saying the conclusion of the pro-argument is wrong, it's saying that the pro-argument does not support that conclusion. That's where we tie in the concept of logical support, is I try to support my conclusion with some evidence, and you come back and say, wait a moment, that evidence you've given does not support that conclusion. So a counter-argument attacks the logic of an argument. Now remember when we were talking about bad logic in arguments in the on Tuesday, where we have some, when we have those argument pairs, some arguments gave other reasons for believing a different conclusion. Others gave reasons to think that the other argument was bad. And that's the difference between a direct argument and a counter argument. So, I'm going to try and do an example. Oops. Actually, I'm going to redo this a little bit. I'm going to give one argument and then two arguments that oppose it. So I'm going to say that here's the pro argument. I'm going to give one pro argument and two con arguments. Is it in the middle? I can't tell. I was served cold soup at a Spanish restaurant. Apparently they have this kind of soup in Spain, it's called gazpacho. All Spanish soup is served cold. By the way, what argument structure am I using here? What is the strategy? How would we abstract that, and how it's related to stuff from the early part of this lecture?
Generalization.
Say again?
Generalization, no?
Yeah, it is a generalization, but more specifically, Right, remember the argument form of the example I gave with the guy with the thallium?
Breaking
Right.
blocks.
So you're saying all Spanish,
Yeah, so what is the abstract form of this? It's one example of this kind of thing has this feature, so all examples of this kind of thing have this feature, which is generally is a very, very weak argument.
it's
Right?
not specific.
Yeah, it's, well, it is specific because it's one kind of soup. Yeah, one bowl of soup, but it's that it doesn't, it's the same thing. One of these has this feature, therefore all of these have the same feature. And that's the abstract thing. You can see that. It's like I was served cold soup, but one bowl of soup that's Spanish soup. One bowl of Spanish soup is served cold. All Spanish soup is served cold. And so you want to be able to look at the argument and see the commonality with the with other arguments. And this is actually a very difficult skill to get, and you have to build up, and you keep trying, doing it again and again and again over the course of the
Is
semester.
that the sweeping?
Yes, sweeping
generalization?
generalization based on an anecdote, yeah. Or just sweeping generalization is a usual name for it. So I'm going to do 2 cons. And I'm going to be a little deceptive because people don't really phrase arguments very well. So there's con 1 and con 2. And I don't know if you can read that. That says not all Spanish soup is served cold. It basically says that's false. And the same over here, not all Spanish soup is served cold. Right. So we have, I don't want to call them, well, gosh, con and counter, yeah. So it's con 1 and con 2. There's that opposing. Right. So we have 3 arguments, 2 of which oppose the other, or 1 of which opposes the other 2. Right. So pro versus con. So you've got the pro argument here. I was served cold soup at the Spanish restaurant. Therefore, all Spanish soup is served cold, generalizing from one example, which is generally is very bad reasoning. First con argument, first opposing argument says that soup is always a hot dish, so not all Spanish soup is served cold. And the other argument says, that's just one dish. That's just one dish of Spanish soup. So here we have an argument based on something that most people already agree with. Right? Soup is almost invariably a hot dish. In fact, until I heard of gazpacho soup, I didn't know soup could be served cold. The idea of a cold soup would have struck me as ludicrous, but then I'm from a cold country. And, you know, just about everything's hot. You know, you don't want cold stuff. I remember when I first came to the United States and I saw people drinking cold tea. I thought, well, iced tea? What the hell are you doing? No, that's horrible. And it is actually. It's It tastes awful.
Iced coffee.
Iced coffee is okay. I finally got to the point like a year ago that I would drink iced coffee. And
Now
it's-
you're a convert.
No, not really. No, when I go to Starbucks, I get a macchiato. I want a little heat to it, and I want
No,
this.
I won't either.
Yeah. So, right, so soup is always cold. So if someone tells me that all Spanish soup is served cold, I say, wait a minute, soup's generally a hot dish. I find it hard to believe that all soup in Spain is always served cold. Then there's this one that says, well, we got this, I served a cold soup at a Spanish restaurant, so therefore all Spanish soup. Hey, that's just one dish of Spanish soup. Now, one of these is, actually, two of these are direct arguments and one's a counter argument. And you've got to know that this is, first of all, this is the direct argument, is a direct argument, because I put this up first and you could stand alone and it didn't look weird, right? So I'm making an argument, it's a generalization based on an anecdote. It's a bad argument, but it is a direct argument. Now, one test for this is if you erased the opposing argument, a counter argument is going to look weird. If you erase the opposing argument, the opposing direct argument will still kind of look okay. So I'm going to get this handy material, and I'm going to put this up over so you can still kind of, right. So pretend that argument is there. Which of these arguments still stands up, and which of them raises question? Yeah, this one still stands up. Because you look at that and says, that's just one dish of Spanish soup. You say, well, what is?
Yeah.
What dish?
Mm-hmm.
You have to refer to something else. So this, soup is almost a direct thing, and what happens is the arrow of opposition comes down to here. It goes down to that, it opposes the conclusion. All Spanish soup is served, but wait a moment, no. It's almost always a hot dish, so it can't be. What you say can't be true. And that makes this another direct argument, although I'll do it right in black. This one, the arrow goes over here, because it's talking about these premises. I was served a bowl of cold soup. Well, that's just one bowl. That's just a dish. Now, this is saying not all soup is served, French soup is not served. It doesn't actually support that conclusion. It really supports pro-argument is bad. It doesn't really support this conclusion. And you'll notice this in debates. And someone will say, well, you're wrong because, and then they say that there's something wrong with the other person's argument, which is a good move tactically, because you have to knock down that argument, but it doesn't prove it. Because all this can prove is that this argument doesn't work. It doesn't prove that this is false. This at least supports the idea that this is false. So technically what happens here is if you have these arguments up here, and if this argument works, right, it supports the claim that not all Spanish soup is cold. And if this argument works, it shows that this argument doesn't. So let's say we've knocked down, right? Say we've knocked down the opposing argument and put up our own direct argument, we've knocked down the opposing direct argument, and we've put up our own argument that hasn't been knocked down, that means that at this point, we're entitled to conclude, and it's most likely that not all Spanish soup is served cold. If you want to argue that all Spanish soup is served cold, you have to come up with something better than this. And if this is all there is, it's not good enough. If someone was to prove it never gets cold in Spain, or the Spanish people are very sensitive to heat and they can't eat hot things, or something weird like that, then maybe we could support that. But we don't have those arguments here. And when we're analyzing arguments, we always analyze just the arguments we have. And I'm out of time. So we always arguments just so that's
That's why